Okay, so we're just going to get started. Unit A review. Everybody has their study sheet, right? I hope so. And all it is a list of the outcomes. So you can take notes. I will send this to you, of course, so you can take notes or just pay attention. So the first outcome was just talking about the one-way flow of energy through the biosphere and how we can store energy in the biosphere, but how it's eventually lost as heat, right? So one-way flow of energy, you've learned a long time ago that energy flows, it doesn't cycle, but matter cycles. So that comes back to us again here. Photosynthesis, everybody knows the equation for photosynthesis, right? And what is it? Very good, yeah. So there's photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide reacts with water to produce oxygen and glucose. And then, of course, cellular respiration is the complementary process. It's just backwards. How is chemosynthesis different? Right, it uses chemical energy instead of sun energy to synthesize organic compounds. And what kind of chemicals could it use? It could use sulfur. Yeah, it could use, I think, hydrogen sulfide. Okay, so it was using chemical compounds and gaining energy from those chemical compounds to produce organic molecules like glucose. And then it becomes the base of the food chain, right? Oh, I'm sorry, we're not quite done. So anyway, cellular respiration, muscle heat generation, decomposition. So what organisms undergo cellular respiration? We do, yep. All animals. Plants do, all plants do. Decomposers produce a lot of carbon dioxide. They undergo cellular respiration when they're decomposing material. Except for chemosynthetic, right? All other organisms should. And anaerobic bacteria. They wouldn't undergo cellular respiration. Okay. Energy transfer by conduction, radiation, and convection. That's way back in grade 8. So remember how we can transfer energy throughout materials, either conduction when it's a solid, convection if it's going through a fluid like a liquid or a gas, and then radiation is just energy traveling in a wave-like form. It doesn't actually need to pass through any matter. Through air or a vacuum, like space. Yeah. All right. Second outcome, explain how energy in the biosphere can be perceived as a balance between photosynthesis and chemosynthesis and cellular respiration. So energy flow in photosynthetic environments, energy flow in the deep sea vents. So we did talk about that in the last outcome as well. So chemosynthetic ecosystems just use chemicals instead of solar energy to make organic compounds. Okay, so they're taking inorganic carbon dioxide and water from the ocean, but using those sulfur compounds or hydrogen sulfide and making organic compounds like glucose. Okay. And of course, photosynthesis gets its energy from the sun, derives energy from the sun, and the sun catalyzes the reaction where we bind carbon dioxide and water together to get the organic form of carbon in glucose and oxygen as a byproduct. Easy enough? Explain how energy in the biosphere can be perceived as a balance between photosynthesis and chemosynthesis and cellular respiration. Right, photosynthesis and cellular respiration are complementary processes. Well, I'm lumping those two together. In a chemosynthetic food chain, it's chemicals that are providing the energy, right? But there's still that cycling of matter because the producers are going to produce carbon dioxide, which will go into the ocean water that the chemosynthetic bacteria are using. Yes. I gave them out yesterday. Oh, look in the bio red bin, or maybe that one. Yeah. Chemosynthetic producers will put carbon dioxide into the water. Or sorry, oxygen into the water. And then the producers, chemosynthetic bacteria. Sorry. You did say it right, Dory. Yes. All right. Okay, the next one, outcome 3, explain the structure of ecosystem trophic levels models such as food chains, food webs. Also junior high outcome, we've talked about these before. But of course, we used a few new words, right? So at the very bottom of food chains and food webs, what do we see? We see producers. And those could be chemosynthetic bacteria, it could be any sort of photosynthetic organism, right? Most of the energy for all food chains comes from the ultimate source of energy for our planet, the sun, right? Okay, so when the sun provides energy to the producers, they're undergoing photosynthesis, and the next level would be the primary consumers. And these would also be called herbivores, right? Primary consumers that eat producers are herbivores. Could a primary consumer in a food chain or food web be an omnivore? Yes, because in the food chain we're just doing a step by step, but omnivores will eat plant material as well. So primary consumers could be herbivores, but they could also be omnivores, right? Right. And then secondary consumers. Yeah. And then secondary consumers would be carnivores, but could a secondary consumer also be an omnivore? Yes. It really depends on the food chain. If it's a food web, I wouldn't ask a question like that because that's not fair. Yeah. I would give you information so that you could definitively pick one answer. Okay. And then tertiary. And so on until you reach the top carnivore. And the top carnivore in a particular food chain might just be the secondary consumer. It really depends, right? So we've talked about all of these, and we know what omnivores, carnivores, herbivores are, producers. Do you remember the term heterotroph and autotroph? Right. And then, of course, all of these would be heterotrophs. Okay. And we also talked about trophic levels. So here we've got producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers. But what about trophic levels? What's the first trophic level? Yes, it is. Right. And then second trophic level, and so on and so forth. Right. And then one other thing we talked about when we were discussing food chains and food webs is that every time we move up a trophic level, we lose a certain amount of energy. So how much is passed from one level to the next? Right. So only about 10% passes from producers to consumers, from primary consumers to secondary, and so on and so forth. So what happens to that wasted energy? 90% is wasted, right? What happens to it? Where is it going? Yeah, heat, inedible, or parts that aren't digested, parts that aren't eaten. Most of it goes as heat. Right? Heat, digestion, waste, which I guess is kind of related to digestion. Okay. Yeah. And other metabolic activities, like when you're hunting an animal, you need to expend a lot of energy to actually capture your food. Okay. Good. All right, then outcome 4 was explain quantitatively the flow of energy and exchange of matter in aquatic and terrestrial sea ecosystem using models such as pyramids of number, biomass, and energy. So we already talked about how about 10% of the energy is lost every time you move up in a level. We talk about biogeochemical cycles next, I think, but in aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, we had 3 different pyramids we looked at. First was pyramid of numbers, which just counted the numbers of organisms needed to support a certain trophic level. Pardon, count. Count the organisms to support a trophic level. And these pyramids generally have a wide base because generally a consumer, an or herbivore, sorry, needs to eat a lot of plant material to get its energy needs, right? So generally there tends to be wider bases, but there are cases where the base underneath is smaller, and there's a few reasons for that. What were some of those reasons that we had a smaller base? Okay, yeah, a few reasons. So small, that's so small. So large producer or a large animal that's taken down, like vultures could eat a very large animal that could support them for a time. Yes, and then fast reproductive rate. So like the algae in the oceans are reproducing very, very quickly, so they tend to have a smaller base because the turnover is very quick. Right, so pyramid of numbers, we counted organisms. It's not very accurate in terms of energy. Large organism, like a large producer that could support, yeah, so then you have a small producer base and then a lot of organisms above that. Okay, biomass is another one that we could use. And biomass, of course, is what? The dry tissue, right? But same thing, dry tissue needed to support the next trophic level. It's a little bit more accurate, but not entirely to show the energy. You can still have the smaller base above, or sorry, below the next trophic level. What? Just without water. The leaves still have, like they are a lot of water, yes, but they still have a lot of matter. I don't know. Oh, I missed one, sorry. Pyramid of energy. There we go. Okay, so pyramid of energy is just calculating the energy and chemical bonds. And this one, of course, is the most accurate in terms of energy flow. This type of pyramid would always have the wide base and narrower at the top. On a test, yes. In nature, no. It probably varies. Okay. No, but we're not eating very much of the cow, right? We leave a lot behind, right? All right, so I'll go on. So biogeochemical cycles, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus. So I did ask you a while ago to draw the nitrogen cycle on your own and see what you could get and how is that going. Okay, all right. So carbon and oxygen cycle we tend to lump together because photosynthesis, cellular respiration are complementary processes. So in the carbon-oxygen cycle, anything that releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere is included. So what sort of things do this? Cellular respiration, forest fires, yeah, burning fossil fuels, decomposition, which is still similar to cellular respiration, but I'm going to include it anyway. Decomposition, volcanic activity, Right. All of those processes can release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And then what processes take it away? Right. Yeah. And then, of course, photosynthesis provides oxygen to cellular respiration. Volcanic activity provides carbon dioxide. Anything else that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? Yes. So the ocean, which is a huge carbon sink, can absorb some of it. And of course, there's photosynthesis going on in the ocean, right? Ocean animals. Um, yeah. Okay, what else? Mm, yeah, and you understand it's not the ocean that's undergoing photosynthesis, it's the producers in the ocean that are undergoing photosynthesis. Or I'd give you a picture and ask you questions about it. I'm not going to make you label any diagrams, but given a diagram, you should be able to interpret it. So I would say in your books, study some of those diagrams: carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle. You should know what they look like. And I know some of them have so much information, especially the carbon oxygen cycle in your textbook was way more complex than what I have here. But you should study it and be kind of familiar with it. Yeah. And I always think of it: what releases carbon dioxide into the air, what removes it, what adds oxygen, what removes oxygen. Okay. And burning actually removes oxygen too, but that just makes sense, right? Anyway, nitrogen cycle then. So I always start nitrogen cycle with atmospheric nitrogen, N2 in the air. It's about 78%, but of course plants can't use it as nitrogen. It needs to be converted into nitrates. In the soil, there's bacteria that can do this. What else does it? Sorry? Lightning, yeah. So that converts nitrogen gas into nitrates. Okay, I'm simplifying it quite a bit here. And then plants can use the nitrates and what are they using nitrates for? They incorporate it into proteins in their tissues, so in their leaves. So protein is made of amino acids. Amino acids, one of their main components is nitrogen. Right? So these plants have protein, they have nitrogen stored in their tissues, and what comes along and eats them? Yeah, yeah. It's huge, but there you go. I can't wait to hear Isaac's interpretation of how big this rabbit is. But anyway, so yes, the rabbit is eating the protein. It incorporates the protein from the plant into its own protein, animal protein. And then it's excreting waste products, right? Animals, namely urine, which is converted to ammonia, yes. Okay, ammonia. And then ammonia can be converted through bacterial action into nitrates again. Okay, and then bacteria can also convert ammonia and nitrates back into atmospheric nitrogen, and that's denitrification. Yeah. Right, and that's denitrifying bacteria that allow denitrification to take place. Nitrifying bacteria that convert nitrogen gas into nitrates. Well, it's the bacteria that are doing this. And of course, yeah, waste products, so when the animal dies, decomposers convert back into ammonia or nitrates. I would not want to come across that rabbit. Has anybody ever seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail? Run away, run away. We got this? I never have. And I'm sharing this with you in your drive ones, okay? Okay, phosphorus cycle, there are two cycles, long-term, short-term. Let's start with long-term. So right. They're having fun next door, yeah. All right, so geologic uplift, the phosphorus is stored in rocks because of sedimentation, and we'll get to that. Geologic uplift brings phosphorus up to the surface so that plants can use it. Okay, and then why do plants need phosphorus? They incorporate it into their tissues. Animals eat the plants, and they need plants for ATP and for bone formation. So what animal can, I'm going to draw a bunny again because that's ones that I can draw that are easy to, okay, that doesn't look anything, it's a rabbit. It's supposed to be a rabbit. Anyway, the rabbit will eat, draw whatever you'd like, yes. The rabbit, of course, is going to eat the plant tissue, incorporate the phosphorus into its own tissues. And why do animals need phosphorus? Bones, ATP, okay? So they need to incorporate phosphorus into their own tissues. They can excrete waste. This is the short-term cycle. Or when they die, there's decomposition that occurs. Decomposition of their own bodies or their waste products. And then the plants can take that phosphorus back into their tissues, and matter cycles in the short-term sense. In the long term, geologic uplift brings it up. Plants can use it. But sediments that are formed from the soil can also deposit. And over enough time, sedimentary rock is formed, pushed down under the ground, right? And geologic uplift can bring it back up again. So that would be the long term. Am I missing anything? I don't think so. Okay, so long term, short term. Pretty straightforward for phosphorus cycle, right? Okay, got it. Next is explain water's primary role in the biogeochemical cycle. Consider its chemical and physical properties. So water, I gave you that assignment you did on computers, and you answered a few questions about water. So why is water such a good solvent? Right. Because water is polar, it has a positive end and a negative end. So the oxygen is very electronegative. It pulls electrons away from hydrogen, giving the oxygen end a slightly negative charge, and then the hydrogen side a slightly positive side. Yeah. So oxygen is electronegative. It pulls electrons away from hydrogen. So the oxygen end becomes slightly negative, leaving the hydrogen slightly positive. So for this reason, water becomes cohesive and adhesive. So its adhesive properties allow it to stick to and attract to other materials, which allow it to be a good solvent. Because when something dissolves, what's really happening to it? It's just being broken apart and dispersed within the solution. Right? So water does that because it's attracted to the particles and it surrounds them. That's what makes water a really good solvent. Water also can undergo hydrogen bonding. Hydrogen bonding is when hydrogen bonds to oxygen, nitrogen, a couple other ones that I can't remember. But it forms a strong bond between the hydrogen ends and the oxygen end. So this oxygen here is slightly negative, and then a positive hydrogen end will be attracted to that slightly negative, and we get a hydrogen bond. That's why water becomes less dense as it's frozen, because the hydrogen bond prevents the water molecules from coming any closer together. Right? Water is the only substance we know of that does this. All other substances, when they get cold and they become solid, the particles move really close together. But water, because of the hydrogen bond, prevents it from getting any closer, so it becomes less dense in its solid form. It would, yeah. It would completely change our Earth. Yeah. Yeah, where we live, lakes wouldn't have enough time to thaw. Lakes wouldn't have enough time to thaw, right? If it froze from the bottom up, like the whole lake would freeze. If water sunk, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Good. Did I go too far? No, we're good. Okay. Interrelationship of energy, matter, and ecosystem productivity. So this is where we were talking about all those different biomes, right? So you know a little bit about each of them, Antarctic Ocean versus tropical seas. That was Ashton and Kylie, I think they did theirs on, right? And obviously biodiversity in the ocean is still high no matter where you are, but Antarctic Ocean would be cooler, right? Tropical seas would probably have more biodiversity and of course undergo photosynthesis for longer periods of time. It would have a lot more fish. It would have a lot of different ecosystems within that ocean area. Yes. Yep. Yep. All right, and then tropical rainforest versus desert. That kind of makes sense. Tropical rainforest we didn't specifically talk about because we were talking about Canadian biomes, but obviously gets a lot of rain near the equator, very, very warm, but a consistent temperature because the forest acts like an insulating blanket. Whereas the desert, very low precipitation, very hot during the day, but cold during the night because it's not there's nothing keeping the heat close to the ground. The desert has very light colored surface usually, so it reflects light away easily, which doesn't allow it to be absorbed and then re-emitted later. It has a high albedo, in other words. Taiga versus tundra, so the boreal forest versus tundra. Boreal forest, if you've ever driven through it, lots of big, tall conifers, the muskeg ecosystem underneath. The soil is very poor, it's very acidic. Biodiversity is moderate. Two seasons, basically, winter and summer, and not a lot of um, biodiversity. And of course, the tundra, permafrost. The tundra has the permafrost layer. The plants need to grow very low to the ground. The growing season is very, very short, like 60 days, I think it was. So plants have to be adapted for that really short growing season. And because it's so cold and windy there, they need to be low to the ground. Most of the animals that live there are migrating animals, or they wouldn't be hibernating, they'd be migrating animals. Okay, and then intertidal zone versus deep sea benthos. We've already talked a little bit about deep sea, and we haven't really talked about benthos. But remember from grade 8, the benthic matter at the bottom of the river. Those of you who went to the river, Battle River. Benthos is just, yeah. Benthos is just all of the dead matter at the bottom of a water body. So it's all that decomposing matter. It's sort of like the litter layer on our soil. And there's a lot of biodiversity, there's a lot of decomposition, a lot of oxygen consumption going on there. And then intertidal zones are where oceans meet fresh water, and those tend to be very biodiverse because they're an ecotone. They're a biome between two biomes, so they have diversity from both ecosystems in one space. And then Arctic versus Antarctic. And that's just another example we didn't really talk about. Antarctic is where nothing lives. It's got a lot more landmass. There's no continental divide. There's no water drainage. Antarctic is considered a desert because there's very, very low precipitation. Yeah, it's a cold desert. Okay. was going to put it in your drive. Yeah, I hope it's still going. Explain how the equilibrium between gas exchange and photosynthesis and cellular respiration influences atmospheric composition. So remember we were talking about the history of oxygen and how at first there was all anaerobic bacteria and then all of a sudden photosynthetic bacteria appeared, early cyanobacteria, and they started producing oxygen. And the oxygen killed all the anaerobic bacteria, right? And almost killed everything else because greenhouse gases were at an all-time low. Temperature decreased. Can I draw this on the board? Okay. No worries. And of course, you all understand what I mean by anaerobic, right? Okay. Don't use oxygen, yeah. Well, they use a very inefficient form of cellular respiration, but we'll learn about it in Unit C. They only produce a very small amount of energy molecules, but they don't need oxygen to do this, but they still use organic compounds. Glucose. Oh, do they use CO2? No, they wouldn't. No. Okay, photosynthetic. Photosynthetic bacteria, cyanobacteria, appeared and started photosynthesizing, increasing the amount of oxygen in the air. But of course that kills the anaerobic because oxygen is a poison to them. Okay. Also, what it did is it used up CO2, and that caused greenhouse gases to decrease. I find it interesting, though, that everybody's so concerned about carbon dioxide, but it's like methane and nitrous oxide have like what 20 30 times the greenhouse gas effect, like the heat trapping effect that carbon dioxide does. And even though carbon dioxide is increasing, right, it is actually increasing in the atmosphere, levels are still remaining very low, right? And you'd be really worried if they were increasing too much because that would affect our breathing rate, right? It needs to stay low. So I don't know that the reduction of carbon dioxide now, the way our atmosphere is now, would have a significant impact. I think it's some of these other greenhouse gases that we need to take a look. That's just my opinion, but I don't know. Haven't done a lot of research. So then we entered an ice age. Okay. The organisms that were able to survive this ice age, photosynthetic organisms that were able to survive, started mass producing oxygen. That's right, yeah, those huge animals, the insects, the huge sloth. So there was a point in time when oxygen content in the atmosphere, as measured by rock strata, was 35%. So, no, it's not. Oh, what did I just do? Sorry. We find it where ocean beds used to exist because it was iron in the ocean that was reacting with the oxygen in the air, creating that banded iron. And it was red when there was oxygen present. It was green when there was no oxygen present. Okay. And of course, once there was enough oxygen, we started seeing a lot more diverse forms of life. And of course, there was that period in time when the oxygen concentration was high. The organisms were very large. And now oxygen content is only about 21% in our atmosphere. And everyone remembers 78% nitrogen, 0.03% carbon dioxide. Yeah. About 78% nitrogen. And then carbon dioxide. That's a 3.03%. Nope. And okay, that must be it. But I did want to say there's something in your outcomes, I'm sure, about rock strata, understanding the idea that we have evidence for the oxygen. Yeah. Yeah, so I must. Right. Okay, so that's a lot there. All right, so just again, I already said, I already talked about it, but the rock strata, and it's in your notes, the geologic history of oxygen. So we see the red bands, and that tells us that there was oxygen present in the atmosphere because iron was in the ocean. And in fact, our planet has a lot of iron, right? We have mostly iron core, and the mantle is mostly iron. So we know that there's a lot of iron, and there was iron in the oceans, reacts with oxygen to produce the red rust. Fe2O3, yep. Okay. Before oxygen was present, we saw the green bands. Okay. Any questions? Oh, sorry. Rock strata. Yeah. So when we examine rock from a long time ago, we see red bands. We know that's because there's iron and oxygen reacting together. And everybody understands how we can measure time using rock strata. We know the oldest layers are at the bottom, youngest layers are at the top. They can also geologically date rocks to get a better idea. It's not foolproof, but it gives us an idea of timeline, right? Okay. Any questions? What's this romantically what?